The air still tasted of cordite and scorched metal, a sharp, ugly tang that clung to the back of the throat. Sheriff Dawson's boot crunched on a piece of twisted steel that had once been a flag-shaped door. He looked from the smoldering crater, where my mailbox used to stand, to the blackened, sagging post. And finally to me, my face lit by the flickering red and blue lights of his cruiser. His expression was a flat, unreadable slab of Texas granite. Behind him, a silver Lincoln Navigator idled, its driver's side window down just enough for me to see the smug, satisfied curve of a smile I knew better than my own. "Son," the sheriff drawled, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You want to tell me why your mailbox appears to have attempted a lunar launch?" Before I could answer, the Navigator's door opened. Brenda Hockley's sensible beige pump touched the dirt of my ranch road, as if testing contaminated waters. She emerged, a vision of powdered vindication and pearl-button malice, the president of the Silver Creek Estates HOA. She clutched a leather-bound binder to her chest like a holy text. "Sheriff," she said, her voice a syrupy poison. As I reported, another blatant and frankly terrifying violation of community safety statutes. Article 4, Section B, Paragraph 2. All mail receptacles shall be of a standard, approved design, and shall not present a hazard or eyesore. This contraption was clearly a hazard. The sheriff sighed, the sound weary and ancient. He'd been out here before. This was different. This was Act 3. But to understand how we got to a mailbox shooting flames into the Texas twilight, you have to go back to the beginning. It started with the sound of gravel popping under tires. Not the slow, respectful crunch of a neighborly visit, but the aggressive, spitting skronk of someone driving too fast for the conditions. I was repairing a section of fence the spring rains had washed out, the smell of fresh-cut cedar and rich black earth filling my lungs. The SUV, a hulking silver Navigator, slammed to a stop, sending a plume of dust over the new posts. Brenda Hockley didn't so much get out as she materialized, a 60-something woman whose blonde hair was helmeted into ruthless submission and whose khaki capris were sharp enough to slice cheese. She surveyed my land, her nose wrinkling as if she'd caught a whiff of something rotten, which was probably just the honest scent of manure from the Hendersons' place down the road. "Mr. Crockett?" she asked, though she knew damn well who I was. "That's me," I said, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my glove. "Brenda Hockley, Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She gestured with a manicured hand toward the sprawling subdivision of McMansions that backed up to my 100-acre ranch. Their perfectly manicured lawns looked like green carpeting, a stark contrast to my wild, live oak-dotted land. "We have a situation." She marched toward my mailbox. It was a simple, rustic thing my grandfather had welded himself decades ago, a long, wrought iron arm holding a weathered steel box with a lone star cut into each side. It was sturdy. It had character. To me, it was a monument to the man who'd built this place with his own hands. To Brenda, it was an affront. "This is non-compliant," she declared, producing a laminated sheet from her binder. It showed a depressingly generic mailbox on a plain white post. "All mailboxes within the HOA's purview must conform to the community standard. You have 30 days to replace it." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my property line ends a good 50 yards before this mailbox. That's county right-of-way. Your HOA's purview ends at your own fence line." Her smile was thin and cold. "The covenants clearly state that any property visible from the common areas, which includes our entrance road, must adhere to the aesthetic guidelines. Your mailbox is the first thing visitors see. It's an eyesore. 30 days. She left without another word, the Navigator spinning its tires as it sped back toward the subdivision's sterile gates. That was my first official introduction to the tyranny of Silver Creek. It wouldn't be the last. The first incident happened a week later. I found my mailbox leaning at a drunken angle, the post splintered just above ground level. It looked like someone had backed into it. A hit and run. An accident. I righted it, packed the earth, and braced it with some spare lumber. I thought nothing more of it. The second time, the entire assembly was gone. Post, box, everything. Just a ragged hole in the ground. That didn't feel like an accident. I drove into town, bought a new post, and sunk it in concrete this time. I welded the box back on, making it stronger than before. A quiet, stubborn defiance was beginning to simmer in my gut. The third time was the charm. It was a Tuesday morning. I came out to find my new mailbox, the one set in concrete, obliterated. Not knocked over, not stolen. Obliterated. It looked like it had been struck by a meteor. Shards of metal were scattered across the road. The concrete foundation was cracked and shattered, and deep, fresh tire tracks gouged the soft shoulder of the road. They led in a frantic, overlapping pattern, circling the crime scene. This was no accident. This was a celebration, an execution. That's when the smell hit me. Not just the dry dust and broken concrete, but the distinct, acrid odor of high-performance diesel exhaust. It hung in the morning air, a calling card. I'd know that smell anywhere. It was the same smell that had lingered after Brenda Hockley's visits. A cold, hard clarity washed over me. This wasn't about a mailbox. This was a message. A declaration of war from a woman who believed her authority stretched as far as her line of sight. She wasn't just going to fine me into compliance. She was going to erase anything that didn't fit her sanitized, beige-colored world, one crushed mailbox at a time. Calling the sheriff was pointless. The first 2 times, Deputy Miller had taken a report, shrugged, and said, "Kids, probably." This time, the tire tracks were undeniable, but so was the problem. The mailbox was on county land. The crime, however, was a property crime against me. It was a jurisdictional mess, a low-priority nuisance case. Brenda knew it. I knew it. She was counting on the sheer bureaucratic exhaustion of it all to grind me down. But she'd misjudged me. She saw a rancher, a man covered in dirt, and thought, simple. She didn't see the 10 years I'd spent as a combat engineer in the Army, diffusing IEDs in places that made this Texas heat feel like air conditioning. She didn't understand that my mind didn't see problems. It saw systems, pressures, triggers, and countermeasures. An improvised explosive device isn't just a bomb. It's a statement, a question, and my job had been to find the answer. Her statement was clear. Your history, your identity, your connection to this land means nothing. Only my rules matter. My answer was going to be just as clear. I didn't rebuild right away. I let the scar in the earth remain. A quiet reminder. I watched. I learned. Brenda's navigator made a habit of patrolling the subdivision's perimeter every evening around 7, her beady eyes scanning my property for any other violations. A fence, posts that needed painting. A gate left open. She was looking for a fight. I gave her one. I went to the county records office. This was my first knowledge bomb, the legal foundation of my entire defense. In Texas, the placement of a mailbox is governed by the Texas Transportation Code, not an HOA's aesthetic whims. Furthermore, an HOA's power is derived solely from the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, that are filed with the property deeds within the subdivision. My deed, for my ranch, predated Silver Creek Estates by 80 years and contained no such covenants. Her authority was a paper tiger, and I had just found the matches. But legal righteousness is a cold comfort when you're picking pieces of your grandfather's mailbox out of the bar ditch. I needed more. I needed irrefutable proof. And I needed to send a message of my own. So, I built a new mailbox. But not just any mailbox. I sunk a new post, deeper than ever, and filled the hole with enough concrete to anchor a light pole. Then I bolted on a brand new, utterly compliant, gleaming white mailbox from the home improvement store. It was the exact model from her laminated sheet. It was bland. It was boring. It was perfect. Brenda drove by that evening. I was sitting on my porch, a sweet tea in my hand, watching. The navigator slowed. I saw her head turn. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. She'd won. She'd broken me. The satisfaction must have been immense. She accelerated, the diesel engine growling as she disappeared back into her perfect little world. She never saw the second post I'd sunk 6 feet behind the first, hidden in the tall Johnson grass. She never saw the wireless motion-activated game camera I'd bolted to a nearby live oak, its lens a dark, unblinking eye. And she certainly never saw the high-lumen infrared illuminator I'd hidden in a fake rock at the base of the post, invisible to the human eye but brighter than the sun to a camera sensor. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All I had to do was wait. It took 3 days. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and orange, when the familiar growl of the diesel engine cut through the evening quiet. This time, it was faster, more aggressive. I was inside, watching the live feed from the camera on my monitor. The silver navigator came into frame, moving too fast. It didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It veered sharply onto the shoulder, aiming directly for the pristine white mailbox. In the crystal-clear night vision-enhanced video, I could see Brenda's face behind the wheel. It wasn't an expression of anger. It was one of pure, unadulterated joy. A smile of predatory triumph. The front right tire of the 2-ton SUV hit the mailbox dead center. There was a spectacular crunch of tearing metal and shattering plastic. The post snapped. The box cartwheeled into the darkness. But then, something else happened. The navigator didn't keep going. It shuddered to a violent, wrenching stop, because the compliant mailbox post was just a sleeve. Inside it was a core of 1-inch solid steel rebar, sunk 4 feet into a cubic yard of concrete. It wasn't a mailbox post. It was a vehicle arrestor. The sound was horrific. The shriek of tearing metal, the explosive whoomp of the airbags deploying, and then the frantic, dying whine of an engine that had just been introduced to an immovable object. The driver's door creaked open. Brenda Hockley stumbled out, dazed, her helmet hair in disarray, a fine white powder from the airbag dusting her shoulders like snowfall. She clutched her chest, coughing. She stared in utter, bewildered horror at the front of her navigator, which was now wrapped tenderly around the unyielding steel post, steam hissing from the ruptured radiator. She never looked up at the live oak tree. She never saw the camera. She just stood there, a queen brought low, her chariot destroyed by the very symbol of her own petty authority. I picked up my phone and called Sheriff Dawson. "Sheriff," I said, my voice calm. "You'd better get out to the county road. There's been an accident, and I've got the whole thing on video." As I hung up, I looked back at the screen. Brenda was now fumbling for her phone, her hands shaking. The game was over. She just didn't know it yet. The evidence was undeniable, crystal clear, and waiting for the authorities. But this was just the beginning of the end. Because when you take on a combat engineer, you better be ready for the counter-assault. And I was just getting started. What she didn't know was that her little hit-and-run habit was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose a corruption scandal. So deep, it would threaten to tear the entire HOA apart from the inside out, and it all started with a mailbox. Where are you watching from? Comment your city below. Because this kind of HOA overreach isn't just a Texas problem, it's an everywhere problem. And if you think this was a satisfying win, just wait until you see what happens next. The silence after the navigator's dying hiss was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a nighthawk and the frantic hammering of my own heart. On the monitor, Brenda Hockley was a ghost in the twilight, her face a pale moon of shock under a coating of airbag dust. She stumbled around the wreckage of her own making, her phone clutched in a trembling hand, its screen casting a bluish glow on her horrified expression. She wasn't calling a tow truck first. She was calling her lawyer. I didn't wait for the sheriff. I grabbed a heavy maglite and walked the 50 yards down my driveway to the county road. The smell hit me first. The acrid, electrical stink of deployed airbags mixed with the sweet, sickly odor of antifreeze leaking onto the hot asphalt. The front of the silver navigator was concertinaed around my mailbox post like a discarded beer can. The pristine white mailbox was gone, shredded into 1,000 pieces of plastic shrapnel littering the ditch. But the steel core stood unbent, unbroken, a monument to immutable physics. Brenda jerked around as my flashlight beam found her. For a split second, raw animal panic flashed in her eyes before it was smothered by a wave of indignant fury. "You!" she spat, the word of venomous accusation. "You did this! You booby-trapped public property! This is attempted murder!" "County property, Brenda," I said, my voice calm, a stark contrast to her hysterical pitch. "And the only thing that was booby-trapped was your own predictable, criminal behavior. The sheriff's on his way. I'm sure he'll be very interested in the high-definition video of you deliberately using your vehicle to destroy private property, again." Her face went from white to a mottled, furious purple. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She, the enforcer, of Rules, the queen of compliance, had been caught on camera committing a Class C misdemeanor, criminal mischief. A smile, thin and cold, touched my lips. This was no longer about a mailbox. This was about evidence. Sheriff Dawson's arrival was a study in weary professionalism. He took one look at the scene, at Brenda's spluttering, accusations, and at my calm offer of the SD card from the game camera, and his shoulders slumped another inch. He took my statement, took the evidence, and had Brenda's wrecked SUV towed. The look she shot me as she was driven away in the deputy's cruiser was pure, undiluted hatred. This wasn't over. It had just escalated to a whole new level. The next morning, the first legal volley arrived not by mail, but by a process server in a cheap suit. It was a formal notice from the Silver Creek Estates HOA, citing me for creating a public hazard leading to property damage and personal injury, and demanding I pay for the complete repair of Brenda's Navigator, a sum totaling over $18,000. The arrogance was staggering. They were charging me for the damage she caused while committing a crime. It was a classic bully tactic. Sue first, ask questions never. They were betting on the fact that a legal battle would be too expensive, too time-consuming for a simple rancher to fight. They were about to learn the second lesson of dealing with a combat engineer. We are masters of logistical warfare. I didn't hire a lawyer. Not yet. Instead, I went back to work. I dove into the Texas Property Code, specifically Chapter 209, which governs homeowner associations. This was my second knowledge bomb, a beautiful piece of legislative poetry. It states that an HOA cannot enforce a restrictive covenant if the covenant is arbitrary, capricious, or discriminatory. More importantly, it mandates that any fine or assessment must be preceded by a fair and impartial hearing. Brenda had skipped that part. She just sent the bill. I typed up a formal, point-by-point rebuttal. I cited the Transportation Code regarding mailbox placement. I cited Chapter 209 regarding the illegality of her arbitrary enforcement. I included still frames from the video showing her SUV's path of destruction. I sent it certified mail to the entire HOA board. Not just Brenda. I was no longer just defending. I was flanking. The response was silence for a week. Then, the whispers started. Old man Henderson, whose property bordered mine, flagged me down at the feed store. He smelled of leather and Copenhagen. Heard you gave Brenda Hockley a spot. Of trouble, he muttered, not meeting my eye. Silver Creek's in an uproar. She's telling folks you're a dangerous vigilante. Got a faction believe in her too. Says you're a threat to the community. A smear campaign. Of course. I was being isolated. Painted as the unstable outsider. The psychological warfare had begun. The community itself was the battlefield, and Brenda was a master of manipulating public opinion. The following Tuesday, I found a notice tacked to my ranch gate. It was an official summons to an HOA hearing. The topic: review of member conduct and assessment of fines for non-compliant, and hazardous modifications to Common View Corridor. They were going after me for the reinforced mailbox post, claiming it was now a modification to the area visible from the subdivision, the very area they had no jurisdiction over. The hearing was set for Thursday night at the Silver Creek Clubhouse. I went. I walked into the lion's den. The clubhouse smelled of stale coffee and expensive perfume. A long table was set up at the front, with Brenda presiding in the center, flanked by 4 other board members, a stooge squad of sycophants and busybodies. The audience was a mix of curious and openly hostile residents. I took a seat in the back, saying nothing. Brenda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel. She didn't look at me. She went through the minutes, the budget report, the landscaping complaints. The pettiness was breathtaking. A 15-minute argument ensued over the acceptable shade of beige for repainting a fence. Another couple was fined $50 for having a child's bicycle left on their driveway overnight. Then, it was my turn. Now, we address a serious safety issue, Brenda announced, her voice dripping with faux concern. Mr. Crockett, of the adjacent ranch, has seen fit to install a reinforced steel obstruction in the county right-of-way, which resulted in a tragic accident and significant property damage. She presented her case like a district attorney, displaying blown-up photos of her destroyed SUV. She didn't mention the video. She didn't mention she was driving it. The narrative was clean. My malicious post had attacked her innocent vehicle. Therefore, she concluded, the board moves to uphold the assessment of damages to be paid by Mr. Crockett and to issue a fine of $500 per day until the hazardous obstruction is removed. I stood up. The room went quiet. Before you vote on that, I said, my voice echoing in the stunned silence, I'd like to know which specific covenant gives the HOA authority over county right-of-way land. And I'd like to enter into the record this video evidence, which clearly shows the context of the accident. I held up a thumb drive. Brenda's face tightened. This is not a court of law, Mr. Crockett. We operate on the rules set forth by our covenants, which don't apply to me or my property, I countered. And under Texas Property Code Chapter 209, you're required to hold a fair hearing before levying fines. A hearing where evidence is presented. This is that hearing. Or are you in violation of state law too? One of the board members, a man named Gary with a nervous tic, looked uneasy. Brenda, maybe we should look at— The board has seen all it needs to see, Brenda snapped, cutting him off. Her control was absolute. All in favor of the motion? 4 hands went up. Gary's went up slowly. Last. Motion carries, Brenda said, slamming the gavel down. The sound was like a gunshot. You have 72 hours to comply, Mr. Crockett. I just nodded. I'd expected nothing less. But I'd seen it. I'd seen the crack in her armor. Gary's hesitation. The first sign of doubt within her ranks. I'd also successfully baited her into holding a legally questionable hearing, a fact I meticulously documented. As I left, a woman slipped out after me. She was in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a tense posture. Mr. Crockett? She said quietly. I'm Sarah Gable. I live on the cul-de-sac. That was appalling in there. It usually is, I said. It's not just you, she whispered, her voice fierce. She fined us $10,000 because our backyard shed is 2 inches too tall. 2 inches! We had to take out a loan to tear it down and rebuild it. She's a monster. There are others. Dozens of us. My fight was suddenly no longer just my own. The stakes had just been broadened from a mailbox to a community under siege. Sarah Gable became my first ally, my inside source. Over the next week, she connected me with other victims of Brenda's reign of terror. There was the Lopez family, forced to rip out their native xeriscape garden and replace it with thirsty, expensive sod because it wasn't uniform. There was the elderly Mrs. Gable, Sarah's mother-in-law, who was threatened with a lien on her house because she flew a Texas flag on a pole that was non-conforming. I started a file, a detailed dossier of every overreach, every arbitrary fine, every whispered threat. I wasn't just collecting stories. I was building a pattern of harassment, a pattern of abuse of power. But Brenda wasn't idle. The smear campaign intensified. A letter circulated in Silver Creek, warning residents about the unstable and litigious rancher next door, who was threatening our property values and our safety. I started getting dirty looks at the grocery store. My tires were slashed, outside the post office. The message was clear: back down or be destroyed. The climax of her campaign came on a rainy Friday afternoon. A county code enforcement officer showed up at my gate. He was a young guy, looking miserable in his slicker. Sorry about this, sir, he said. We got an anonymous complaint, alleging unpermitted structural work and improper sewage disposal. He walked my property, looking for violations. He found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But the intent was clear: to use the government itself to harass me, to drain my time and my spirit. As he was leaving, he paused. Between you and me, he said sotto voce, we get a lot of complaints from Silver Creek, usually about each other. This HOA president, Hockley, she's a piece of work. Files complaints on her own neighbors if they look at her cross-eyed. It was a tiny piece of validation, but it was fuel. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the drone of the rain on the roof the only sound, and I spread out the entire dossier. The photos of the destroyed mailboxes, the fraudulent HOA fine, the transcript from the kangaroo court hearing, the sworn statements from Sarah Gable and the Lopez family, the code enforcement report, and the video, the crystal clear, irrefutable video of Brenda Hockley's smiling face as she committed a crime. I saw it all now, not as isolated incidents but as a campaign. A systematic abuse of power designed to crush any and all opposition. She wasn't just a bully, she was a petty tyrant, and her kingdom was Silver Creek Estates. But I had her. I had the pattern. I had the evidence. And I had the law. My third knowledge bomb was the most powerful yet, a tactical nuke disguised in legalese. It's a concept known as ultravires, a Latin term meaning beyond the powers. An HOA, as a corporation, can only act within the powers granted to it by its governing documents and state law. Every fine levied without a proper hearing, every rule enforced outside its jurisdiction, every threat made without legal authority, was an ultra-vires act. And board members can be held personally, financially liable for ultra-vires acts. Brenda wasn't just risking her position, she was risking her house, her car, her savings. I packaged it all together. The dossier, the legal citations, the video evidence. I made 3 copies. One for my lawyer, whom I finally retained, a sharp pit bull of a woman who specialized in reining in rogue HOAs. One for the district attorney's office, to formally press charges for criminal mischief against Brenda. And one for the local investigative reporter at the Austin newspaper who had a known fondness for stories about corruption and little guys fighting back. I dropped the packages in the mail on a Monday morning. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, steaming the water off the pastures. The trap had been baited, sprung, and documented. Now the real counter-assault began. The waiting was the hardest part. Every ring of the phone, every car on the road, felt like a potential announcement of the coming storm. I knew the packages had been delivered. I knew the wheels were turning. But in the silence, doubt began to creep in. What if the DA was friends with Brenda? What if the reporter didn't care? What if my lawyer's letter was just another piece of paper for Brenda to ignore? The answer came not with a phone call, but with the sound of a car door slamming shut. I looked out my window. A sleek, black sedan with tinted windows was parked in my driveway. A man in a dark suit was walking toward my porch. He looked official. He looked serious. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. Either Brenda had somehow convinced the state to come after me, or my counter-offensive had just reached its target. The man knocked on the door, a sharp, authoritative rap. I took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. The war for my grandfather's mailbox was about to enter its final, decisive phase, and the battle lines were now drawn right on my front porch. The knock was a sharp, percussive sound that cut through the quiet hum of the ranch, a sound that didn't belong. The man on my porch stood with the patient stillness of someone used to being waited for. His suit was too crisp, his posture too straight for a social call. Through the screen door, I could smell the faint, clean scent of rain on wool and a hint of expensive aftershave. "Elias Crockett?" he asked, his voice a neutral, professional baritone. "That's me," I said, my hand resting on the doorframe. The grain of the wood felt familiar, solid under my fingertips, a stark contrast to the uncertainty standing on my welcome mat. He produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge. "Special Agent Miller, Office of the Attorney General, Consumer Protection Division." He didn't smile. "We received a rather comprehensive package. We'd like to talk to you about Brenda Hockley and the Silver Creek Estates HOA." The tension that had been coiling in my shoulders for weeks didn't break. It transformed. This wasn't a local sheriff or a corrupt code inspector. This was the state. The packages had landed. The counter-assault had begun. Agent Miller sat at my kitchen table, a cup of black coffee steaming between his hands. He listened, his eyes missing nothing, as I walked him through the entire saga. The mailboxes, the video, the kangaroo court hearing, the smear campaign. I laid out the dossier, each piece of evidence a tile in a mosaic of petty tyranny. He didn't interrupt. He just took notes on a slim digital tablet, the soft tap of his stylus the only sound in the room. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the grazing longhorns. "Ultravires," he said finally, almost to himself. "It's a powerful term. Most people don't know it. They just know they're being bullied." He turned his gaze back to me. "We've been hearing whispers about Silver Creek for a while. Your package. It's the catalyst we needed. It's not just about a mailbox anymore, Mr. Crockett. It's about a pattern of systematic abuse. We're opening a formal investigation. The relief was so potent it felt like a physical thing, a wave of warmth washing through me. But it was followed by a cold, sharp clarity. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Brenda Hockley didn't strike me as the type to surrender gracefully. I was right. The news of the state's investigation broke like a summer storm. The local paper ran the story on the front page, right below the fold. State probes Silver Creek Cho over alleged tyrannical tactics. The reporter I'd contacted had done her job beautifully, weaving a narrative of unchecked power and a community living in fear. She'd even quoted the infamous 2-inch shed story from Sarah Gable. The fallout was immediate and vicious. Brenda's response wasn't contrition. It was a full-scale siege. Overn's Silver Creek Estates became a fortress of paranoia. Support our HOA signs sprouted on manicured lawns like poisonous mushrooms. Residents who had privately confessed their fears to me now refused to make eye contact in town, their faces tight with a new kind of anxiety. Brenda had convinced them the state was coming for their property values, their way of life, and that I was the treasonous catalyst. Then, the eviction notice came. Not for me, for Sarah Gable. It was delivered by a sneering man in a Silver Creek security polo shirt. The pretext was a years old, previously waived fine for a misplaced garbage can. The amount had been inflated with absurd administrative fees and late penalties, creating a debt she couldn't possibly pay immediately. It was a blatant act of retaliation, a message to anyone else who might think of speaking out. "This is what happens." Sarah called me, her voice shaking with rage and tears. "She's going to take my house, Elias. She's actually going to take it." That was the turning point. Brenda had overplayed her hand. She'd moved from harassing me, the outsider, to devouring her own. The community, already simmering with resentment, finally reached a boiling point. The stage was set for the final showdown, the annual HOA meeting. It was held in the same clubhouse, but the air was different tonight. It was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and cheap coffee, charged with a palpable current of dread and anticipation. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. News cameras, alerted by my lawyer, were set up at the back, their red lights glowing like malevolent eyes. Brenda took her seat at the head table, but her usual aura of invincibility was gone. She looked pinched, her makeup applied too thickly in a futile attempt to hide the strain. She called the meeting to order with a weak rap of the gavel. She tried to stick to the script, reading through the mundane agenda items, but the audience was restless, a hungry beast waiting to be fed. Finally, she couldn't avoid it. "New business," she announced, her voice brittle. Gary, the board member with the nervous tic, stood up. He cleared his throat, the microphone squealing with feedback. I make a motion to immediately dismiss all fines and penalties against Elias Crockett and Sarah Gable, and to withdraw the assessment for the vehicle damage." A gasp went through the room. This was open rebellion. Brenda's face flushed crimson. "The chair does not recognize that motion," she snapped. "It's not on the agenda. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which our bylaws adopt, a motion from the floor is perfectly in order during new business," a new voice said. It was my lawyer, Deborah Shaw, standing from her seat in the front row. She looked like a hawk eyeing a field mouse. I would also remind the board that continuing to pursue these fraudulent fines in light of the state investigation could be construed as further evidence of ultra vires actions, opening each board member to personal liability, she'd used the term. The knowledge bomb detonated in the middle of the room. You could see the confusion on some faces, the dawning horror on others who understood its meaning. Personal liability, their homes, their savings. Brenda spluttered. "This is outrageous. This is a hostile takeover by an outside agitator." "No." "Brenda," I said, standing up. My voice carried without a microphone. The room went dead silent. "This is a hostile takeover ending. This is the community you were supposed to serve finally finding its voice." I looked out at the sea of faces. Sarah Gable, the Lopez family, Old Man Henderson, dozens of others I'd never met, but who had been victims of her pettiness. "How many of you have been fined for a flower pot on your porch? For a swing set? In your backyard? For a flag you wanted to fly? How many of you are afraid to paint your own house a color you like? A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded. She doesn't have the power, I continued, my gaze locking back on Brenda. She never did. You gave it to her. You were afraid of the fines, afraid of the lawsuits, afraid of the gossip. But the only power she has is the power you let her have. The state is investigating. The media is watching. The game is over. It was then that Special Agent Miller entered the clubhouse. He didn't say a word. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed. His presence a silent, devastating fact. Brenda saw him. Her face crumpled. The mask of the powerful HOA president shattered, revealing the small, frightened woman beneath. She looked out at the hostile crowd, at the cameras, at the state investigator, and finally at me. The fight drained out of her. The gavel slipped from her fingers and clattered on the table. A motion for a vote of no confidence was made and seconded by a dozen voices at once. It passed in a thunderous, unanimous roar. Brenda Hockley and her entire board were removed on the spot. In the weeks that followed, the empire crumbled. The state investigation concluded with a searing report that led to Brenda paying a hefty personal fine for her actions and being permanently barred from serving on any HOA board in the state. The fraudulent fines were wiped away. The liens were lifted. The eviction notice against Sarah Gable was torn up. A new board was elected, with Sarah as its president. Their first act was to amend the covenants, stripping away the most arbitrary and oppressive rules. The second was to formally apologize to me and to the community. On a bright, clear Saturday morning, I sank a new post on the county right-of-way. This one wasn't made of rebar and concrete. It was a fresh cedar post, straight and true, and onto it I bolted the original mailbox, the one my grandfather had welded, its steel dented and scarred from its repeated battles, the Lone Star cutout still standing proud. I'd fished it out of the bar ditch after the last attack, a piece of my history she'd failed to destroy. As I tightened the last bolt, a car slowed down. It was Sarah Gable in her minivan. She pulled over and got out, carrying a small fabric-wrapped bundle. "For you," she said, handing it to me. "From all of us." I unwrapped it. It was a new flag, Texas on one side, and on the other, the image of a rustic mailbox with a single, defiant word underneath. Standing. I ran it up the pole I'd installed next to the mailbox. It caught the wind and snapped open, waving proudly against the vast blue Texas sky. The smell of cedar and prairie grass filled the air. Down the road, the gates of Silver Creek Estates stood open, no longer a barrier but an entrance. It was over. The war for a mailbox, for a principle, for a community's right to breathe, was finally won. The victory wasn't in the humiliation of a bully, though that was satisfying. It was in the restoration of what was right. It was in the sight of the Lopez family planting a vibrant, water-wise garden of native wildflowers in their front yard. A riot of color against the beige conformity. It was in the sound of children's laughter from a swing set that no longer had to be hidden. It was in the quiet, steadfast presence of a scarred, star-cut mailbox standing sentinel on a country road. A permanent reminder that some things are worth fighting for, and that no one, not even a self-appointed queen with a clipboard and a silver SUV, is above the law. This was more than a takedown. It was a liberation. And the story doesn't end here. It continues in every homeowner who reads this and finds the courage to say no more. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below. Let's see how far this corruption spreads. And if you believe that fairness should always trump tyranny, hit subscribe. Because together, we can make sure that the only thing an HOA ever crushes is the weeds in the common area flower beds, and not the spirit of the people it's meant to serve.